Hi, welcome to Chapter 10 on the presidency. I'm going to give you an overview on the roles of the president, from head of state, party leader, chief executive, commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, and chief legislator, to the different powers that the president has, and then a brief overview of the executive organization, right? Because it's not just the president in the executive office, but a whole slew of people and bureaucracy. Just like some of the civil liberties, some of the duties of the president are in tension with one another, sometimes even in conflict. And part of the position of the president is navigating through the hard choices and the trade-offs. So I'll highlight some of those as we talk about each of the roles of the president. So firstly, the president is the head of state, right? The ceremonial head of the government that's supposed to stand above any kind of partisan politics and represents the entire nation. For example, the Queen of England, the Emperor of Japan, and the President of Israel are all heads of the state. Their prime ministers actually make the policies that govern the countries, and they're sort of the head of the government, and they're above partisan politics, right? For instance, the Queen of England is supposed to represent every English person, right? Not, English people of particular political parties, right? So it's similar for the president of the US. He or she is supposed to represent all Americans, right? Republicans and Democrats alike. Just like the seal, right? E pluribus unum, out of many, one. But this seems to be in conflict with another presidential role, which is the party leader, right? Technically, the president is also the leader of his or her party. Thinking about this, right? So the leader of the political party is supposed to work to forward his particular or her particular party's goals, right? Focusing on issues and public policies that are important to their platforms, right? So of course we can see kind of easily how this can be in conflict, right? Thinking about especially the growing partisanship in the US, right? We learned about this couple of chapters ago, this gulf between Republicans and Democrats and this lacking compromise between the two parties. It can be pretty difficult to navigate representing the entire nation, the interests of all Americans, as well as representing your own party's interests that, for some actually might be in conflict with some Americans. So we have those two roles. Then we have, thirdly, the president is the chief executive. There's an enforcing of acts of Congress, judgments of the federal courts, and treaties signed by the U.S., right? So the chief executive has a duty to faithfully execute these laws. So enforcing the acts of Congress means that if there's any sort of court judgments or any treaties that are signed by the U.S., the president is supposed to enforce these. There's appointment power, right? The authority to fill a government position. This is, of course, limited to certain positions, right? The president doesn't appoint every single position, right? It's limited to the cabinet and the sub-cabinet jobs, federal judgeships, and agency heads. So that's about 8,000 of the 2.1 million federal jobs. There is another power, the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the U.S., which means that the president could grant a pardon to someone in jail or on death row, for example. Of course, impeachment is not included in that. There's another power that goes beyond the faithful execution of the laws that Congress makes, and it's called an executive order. And it's basically the presidential decree that does not need Congress's approval. Some of the executive orders have been kind of basic or banal, like Clinton declaring wilderness areas off limits to snowmobiles, but others have been focused on international relations or domestic issues, like introducing new guidelines for interrogating enemy combatants. That was introduced by Bush and rewritten by Obama. Requiring government preparation for the impacts of climate change. That was an executive order by President Obama. And also blocking companies from trading with Cuba or Iran. That was initially Bush's executive order, I think confirmed by Obama, but now things have changed, of course. The embargo has been lifted from Cuba. We have other executive orders in history, some examples here, right? The Louisiana Purchase by Jefferson. The Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln was actually an executive order. FDR's executive order involved interning Japanese Americans during World War II. Truman desegregated the Army via an executive order. And as I mentioned, there were some changing rules regarding the War on Terror from George W. Bush. So there's some examples, I guess, not I guess, I mean, there are some great things that were done via executive orders. Obviously, emancipating the slaves or desegregating the Army. And then there were some that are maybe sort of neutral, or depending on what side of history you're on, they can be considered good or bad, right? The Louisiana Purchase was great for the U.S. and less so for the French whom we purchased it from. And then, of course, you have the kind of stuff that's terrible, right? The interning of Japanese Americans during World War II. And again, these are Japanese Americans, right? That can be an example of a crappy executive order, right? And a lot of these rules during the War on Terror can be considered sort of objectively not great. I think I will leave it here for this one. It was an important thing to remember, though, before I continue. An executive order does not have the staying power of a law. So technically, the next president can rescind an executive order that was made by a previous president. You don't generally see that, but it is possible. So fourthly, the president is also the commander-in-chief. Congress declares war, and the president is supposed to manage it. And that is, of course, quite a task for a military like the U.S.'s. Today we have an active duty force of 1.3 million with 850,000 in reserve. And these numbers have actually decreased by a third. There's a defense budget of 620 billion, higher than the next 10 countries combined. And of course, this budget does not include the Department of Veteran Affairs, Homeland Security, or intelligence agencies. So the president, the U.S. president, oversees the world's largest fighting force, and one with a very global presence, as you can see from this map here. Lots of military bases, lots of countries with access arrangements, or other forms of military cooperation, right? A ton in the Middle East, the Southeast here, Europe, Costa Rica, what am I saying? The Central America. So Congress is the only entity that can declare formal war, but since 1945, right, the nuclear age, military response time has shortened considerably. And there is the argument that it's too fast, right? War can come too fast to wait for congressional deliberation. So in 1973, after Korea, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which allows the president to send troops somewhere, right? But then requires congressional approval within 60 days. So the president can send troops, but within 2 months, right, there has to be congressional approval. And if the Congress doesn't approve, in theory, the president has to bring them back. So some say, well, this is a check on presidential power, right? Is it? Well, in practice, Congress always authorizes the force, right? And there's many reasons for this. Partially, it looks bad foreign policy-wise if you have sort of a Congress and a president that are at odds. But also, just practically speaking, it's hard to bring back troops, right? Especially when you've changed stuff on the ground, when there's domestic issues in the country that you've invaded or entered, I guess you can say in a more neutral sense. And what's interesting is most of the time that the U.S. has sent troops into conflict, especially in the 20th and 21st century, it's been via the president acting as commander-in-chief without a formal declaration of war, right? It's the president using the powers given to him by the War Powers Act. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, twice to Iraq, Grenada, Panama, other interventions in South America. So I guess we can look at the evidence and say perhaps the War Powers Act is not a check on presidential power, though it does require congressional approval within 60 days. Maybe that's not such a strict control. Something to consider. An important power of the president as chief diplomat is the diplomatic recognition, or the power to recognize or refuse to recognize foreign governments as legitimate or illegitimate. Especially in international relations, this is a huge deal. For example, if you are South Sudan, right, a new country that is split from Sudan or from North Sudan, you want to be formally recognized by the international community, especially by the most powerful country in the world, arguably speaking. If you're not recognized, you often don't get a seat at the table at international organizations like the UN or regional ones like the African Union or the African Bank, right? So as the chief diplomat setting an overall framework for the American role in global affairs, the president has diplomatic recognition. He or she also has the power to negotiate treaties. Only the president can negotiate treaties, but only the Senate can ratify them or approve them with a 2/3 majority required. So it's an important distinction, right? The president negotiates, I'm sorry, this says treatise. This is supposed to say treaties. The president negotiates treaties, but the Senate, ratifies them, right? And if the Senate makes any changes to the treaty, the president can also choose to withdraw that treaty. So the president can also make what are called executive agreements, or agreements with the other heads of state without Senate approval. Though, of course, Congress can also refuse to give money to implement anything. So we have here treaties and executive agreements, right? And it's important to realize the difference. Treaties bind all succeeding administrations, right? So if President Obama makes a treaty with some country or some organization, future presidents have to abide by it, right? Treaties cannot be changed, or they're not changeable between different administrations. Executive agreements, right? These are these special agreements with other heads of state, right? Let's say if President Obama goes to Sweden or, I don't know, some country in Southeast Asia, doesn't matter, and makes an agreement with their president or their prime minister, that is particular only to the Obama administration, right? So the next president can consent to keep that in effect or can change it. That's not a problem. Now, of course, there are some benefits to executive agreements versus treaties, right? Thinking about the Senate, it takes time to get things passed, right? So, especially in this world that we live in, which is very quickly moving, there's technological advances, there's different security issues that have changed the need for speed. So you get that from an executive agreement, right? Speed, secrecy, especially during a crisis, that's really essential. If you think about it, open senatorial debate could be actually really detrimental to the best interests, national interests of the U.S., especially if something is happening, right? But of course, there's potential dangers in these, right? Secrecy and speed could also be a bad thing, right? There's a lot of power in the executive office to secretly and quickly make an agreement that could be really detrimental, right? Or just dangerous. So kind of a double-edged sword there. But they are easier. There's been 9,000 executive agreements and only 1,300 treaties. So I think most presidents can see the benefits of an executive agreement over a treaty. Although they have become rarer. These are executive orders. Let me just go back for a second. I don't know why this is here, but I think I might have moved this one. I think I got a question in one of my other classes about executive orders, and that someone had heard that President Obama has done the most executive orders. And so I thought, let's actually figure this out and see. The beginning of our country did not see many executive orders, but as you got through Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, all the way through FDR, who had the absolute most, this is sort of the most executive orders we've seen, and they've kind of tapered off a bit, actually. I believe the blue are Democrats and the red are Republicans. So you can see there are some Republican presidents that have issued a ton of executive orders. Just something I thought I would highlight. Okay, so continuing on, the president is also a part of the legislative process as the chief legislator. And he or she is supposed to provide information on the State of the Union, recommend different measures for Congress, and veto legislation, right? So the State of the Union is actually required by the Constitution. It's given in late January. It's basically a broad, comprehensive view of the legislative program, right? What the president wants to achieve and wants wants Congress to achieve during its session. So it's a message to Congress, and it's also a message to the people of the U.S., right, and the rest of the world. The president can't pass laws or even actually formally propose any laws, so he or she relies on supporters in each chamber to submit their bills. And the White House also has a congressional liaison team to try to negotiate and cut deals. Measuring a president's legislative success is referred to as his or her batting average. So all the bills that the president endorses, or the most important bills, or the bills that the other party opposes, right? So for example, how many bills a president supports in proportion to how many of those bills actually became laws, right? It's thinking about, like, in baseball. Okay, I'm not really an expert in baseball, but right, it's how many times you swing the bat and how many times you actually get a hit, right? That could be one example. So how many times the president is up to bat proposing or supporting different laws, and how many times those laws actually become enacted, right? Or bills, right? So the endorsing of bills versus the bills becoming laws, right? That's a batting average. I think I actually have a slide on that right here. I do indeed. So this is some examples of presidential batting averages. Right? The percent of congressional votes supporting the presidential's position, right? So Dwight D. Eisenhower had a pretty good batting average, right? And who had a crappy one? Let's see. Looks like George W. Bush. And as you can tell, if the party of the president and the congressional control is the same party, you generally have a really high batting average, right? Obviously, Republicans are controlling Congress here. Dwight D. Eisenhower is a Republican, so there's not much that they should be disagreeing on, right? So in his first years in office, 86% batting average, right? The next year, he's obviously still a Republican, but now the Democrats control Congress, there's a considerable decrease, right? In that. Let's see, do we have any other examples? I'm sure there's a ton here, right? Right, John F. Kennedy, Democrats are controlling Congress, also has a really high batting average here. There's a low one here, Gerald Ford, Republican, but the Democrats are controlling Congress, so not so high, right? You can see, oh, this is a good one. Barack Obama, Democrat. Democrats controlled Congress his first years in office. Look at that, 92% batting average. Still a Democrat, obviously, the next time around, but there's mixed control. You have a Republican House, 52%, considerable decrease there, right? Interesting. Okay, we have the State of the Union. We have recommending measures for Congress. We also have veto power. The president has veto power, right? If he or she wants to block an act of Congress, he or she can refuse to sign it. There's a couple of different ways to do this, right? So the president can obviously sign the bill that's passed through Congress, the bill becomes law, right? If the bill is not sent back within 10 days, it automatically becomes law. The president can also reject the bill with a veto message, right? So it says, okay, I don't like this bill, but I think if we make these changes, we can pass it. Okay, or I'll sign it. So Congress can make those changes and try to repass it. The other alternative is the president can refuse to sign it, and if Congress adjourns within 10 working days of the bill being sent back, the bill is killed. This is called a pocket veto. And the bill has to be reintroduced in the next session, right? Because if the president refuses to sign it and we have this 10-day kind of clause, but Congress is adjourning within 10 days, the bill is killed, right? There's no more days for Congress to try to change it and deal with it, right? So that's called a pocket veto. And then if Congress has the ability to get 2/3 majority vote, they can also override a presidential veto. But of course, very difficult. 2/3 majority is pretty huge, and Congress tends to be pretty contentious. What's interesting, again, kind of thinking about historically speaking, the veto was used a ton back in the day. Roosevelt, Truman, Carter vetoed 73, 74, and 19 bills, respectively, in their first 2 years in president. In in contrast, Bush had only 11 vetoes and Obama only 5. That's kind of interesting. Here we have a chart on presidential vetoes and congressional overrides to kind of show you that it's pretty difficult to do, right? So these are the number of vetoes in blue here, right, by some presidents from John F. Kennedy up to, I think, yep, we have at least 2014 for Barack Obama, and the number of overrides, right? So pretty difficult to do. Okay. So I just kind of want to wrap up with some of the classifying powers of the president. And there are 3 types: express powers, delegated powers, inherent powers. And you see these throughout the different presidential roles. So I wanted to go over the roles before we went over these types of powers so we can have a better idea of the examples. So, oops. So, interestingly, Article 1 of the Constitution meticulously defines everything that Congress is empowered to do. It goes on for 52 paragraphs. Article 2, by contrast, which is for the president's powers, says kind of relatively little on who the president is, what he or she can do. There's only 13 paragraphs to describe the office. And this vagueness is why the office of the president keeps evolving. But the Constitution is very clear about the powers and the duties of the chief executive in certain ways, and limits the number of expressed powers or formal grants of authority. So we know this already, right? Express powers are the formally or explicitly given powers by the Constitution, and this is of course balanced by the corresponding congressional powers. So we have balance here. The express powers of the president include being the commander-in-chief of the Army, Navy, and state militias, right? But that's balanced by Congress because Congress has the power to declare war. Only Congress has the ability to set the military budget, and only Congress can make rules governing the military. We talked a little bit about this power to declare war thing and how the president can actually do some executive actions. But in theory, at least, there is some balance here, right? On the other side, right, president can make treaties, appoint ambassadors, and select Supreme Court judges, but balanced by Congress, right? All of these have to be done with approval from the Senate. And of course, the other express powers, right, that are expressly written in the Constitution for the president is the ability to grant pardons, reprieves, and a requirement to actually give the State of the Union. Right? And we see these express powers throughout the different roles, right? Okay. The president draws real authority from a very simple phrase at the end of Section 3 of Article 2 of the Constitution. Take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Congress votes on legislation and then sends it to the executive office to execute them, right? Put them into effect. In other words, Congress grants delegated powers to the president, right? It delegates, it's passing on power to someone else. So these are the delegated powers, right? We went from expressed powers, and of course how they're balanced by Congress, to delegated powers. And this is for practical reasons and historical reasons and also some political reasons. So practically speaking, Congress needs to delegate power, right? There's a ton to do. Detailed legislation needs experts. The executive branch has these experts. So practically speaking, it's great to delegate some of these things to the executive office, right? Historically speaking, until the 20th century, Congress actually did a lot. Remember dual federalism, right? The progressive era, via the New Deal, remember FDR, and the changes to the type of federalism we had, that made more executive power, right? That gave more executive power, to the president, right? And politically speaking, Congress has sort of a incentive to delegate powers to the president or the executive office because no one really wants to get blamed for a bad outcome of a law, right? That would, of course, affect re-election for Congresspeople. So they grant broad discretion in a law so that they can avoid sole responsibility. So the delegated powers come from this one little section here, especially this one sentence. And Congress basically delegates a lot of this to the president. And if Congress delegates it, these powers can technically be rescinded as well. Okay, so we had the express powers, delegated powers, and now lastly we just need to, go to the inherent powers. So inherent powers are not specified by the Constitution or delegated by legislation, but they are, so they are kind of implicit. There's a vague Article 2 phrase, the executive power shall be vested in a president, right? This one little sentence. So this has led to an expansion of the presidential powers, especially during a crisis. For example, sending troops into a country or into a conflict without formal declaration of war, right? Which we know is done only by Congress. Only Congress can declare war formally. But since it's not technically a war, the president can get around this, right, via the War Powers Resolution Act. So because of this, we have, especially during conflict, a lot of power being given to the president, right? So we have examples here: military intervention, also negotiating some executive agreements, right? They're informal. I wouldn't call them treaties, but I guess you can call them informal treaties. Sure, that's fine. But they don't need ratification by the Senate, right? So just to wrap up here, we often think of the executive branch as just the president, but there is an entire federal bureaucracy that is technically a part of the executive branch. So at the top of this bureaucracy is the cabinet, right? You have this advisory group of people that the president has chosen to help make decisions. And this includes the heads of 15 departments, plus whoever the president wants to name to the cabinet. And of course, it differs from president to president. Then you have the executive offices of the president, or the EOP. And this is made up of agencies and advisors that help the president manage daily activities, right? It's usually each of the staff members are assigned and have expertise in a particular policy area, like drug policy, healthcare, the budget, etc. In the EOP, so this is sort of the umbrella branch, right? In the EOP, you have the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and they have power over the federal budget. Its director drafts the annual federal budget that the president presents to Congress each January for approval, right? Just like we learned last module. Remember, the executive office introduces the federal budget, right? And then it goes through Congress. The OMB also has what is called central clearance power. They review and okay anything a member of the administration does or says in public. So every speech or opinion piece, every congressional testimony or policy that they propose has to go through the OMB first. So they vet every administrative proposal, right? When Congress passes a bill, the OMB coordinates with various White House officials' recommendations about either signing or vetoing, and the OMB usually gets the last word on it. There's also the National Security Council under the executive office of the president, and they are usually the link between key foreign policy and key military advisors. It includes the powerful people who make national security, right? The Secretary of State, Defense, Intelligence, Treasury, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it's run by the National Security Advisor, who has become a very influential and important figure. And then lastly, you have the whole White House staff, right? The key personal or political advisors to the president, the press secretary, speechwriter, legal counsel, etc. Watch The West Wing if you want a really good dramatization of the White House kind of staff and the whole executive office kind of thing. It really showcases all the different roles and people in the White House and some interesting issues that are faced by the administration. So I'd highly recommend it. West Wing, it's probably on Netflix. Check it out. So this is where I'll leave you. Of course, any questions, please don't hesitate.